This is Ryan Pierce, host of Completely Serious. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey, it's Baxter Colburn here from Public House Media. Did you know that we just added a store here at Public House Media? No, I'm not talking about a grocery store where you can go buy apples or bananas or peanut butter, which are all fantastic, especially when peanut butter's on all of those. Anyway, we've added a store here at Public House Media so you can not only come and represent your favorite podcast network, but also represent your favorite shows as well, too. Just go over to thephmedia.com and look in the top right corner where you'll see the button that says Store. Click on that and you can search through all of our great products. Or if you go to our Facebook page, Public House Media, you can see on the left-hand side a tab that says Store. All of our products are listed there as well too. It's the new Public House Media store. You don't want to miss it. It is fantastic. Buy some of that great swag to support your favorite shows and to support Public House Media. Check it out today.
This is Rachel Mullins, host of #NoFilterFriday here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my new show, #NoFilterFriday, where we talk about all of the sexual misconduct allegations swirling around Hollywood. A new show drops every Friday at 8:30 Pacific Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of #NoFilterFriday. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppie. Find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. Check them out on Facebook. Check them out also at thephmedia.com. But if you really want to find out more about me, you probably should just listen to the podcast because I talk more about myself on the podcast than there actually is information on the website. I'm pretty close to having a book out, and you'll be able to check that on the website. The name of the book is In Memoriam, and the subtitle is The Ninth Hour. So that I'll be telling you when that comes out. It'll be out really soon. And by really soon, when you hear me say soon, it's probably like months. It's not like days. It's probably months. But I mean, this is only once a week, so in the lifetime of this podcast, it's out pretty stinking soon. So we are going to jump into the word of the week, and I think that for me, because I want to be able to write really well, and to write really well, I think that I need to know as many words as I possibly can. So when I read a book, especially older books, because newer books really don't do this, when I read a book and I run across a word I don't know, I write the word down. I actually have a notebook filled with words that I either have learned through books or words that I've learned either through books. I was at one point, and I should continue to do this. I'm really weird. I was at one point, I wonder where my dictionary is. I have this big, huge dictionary, like a college dictionary, and I was going through it, and I was going through it and finding words I didn't know, and I was finding words I thought were interesting, or the meanings of words were interesting. So I write those down, and I keep them for later, because then I can go through and be like, oh yeah, that's what that word means. These are the different words I learned. It's kind of like I'm in third grade still. But our word of the week is quiescence. And some of you might think that sounds like acquiesce, which it's related to acquiesce, but it does not mean the exact same thing. So quiescence is a state of quietness or inactivity, all right? So a quiescent state is one in which a game is unlikely to change. So if you're talking about a game, if you're talking about any sort of game, the game is unlikely to change if it's quiescent, okay? Which I think is an interesting addition to that definition. Man, I can't talk. So we'll see how this podcast goes because I'm already beginning to get distracted by things. So last week I talked about Octaviarium, I talked about artistic motifs, and this week I am going to be talking about my writing. And I think that once you hear how I write, you'll understand exactly how that connects to Octaviarium, how that connects to artistic motifs. And I did explain a little bit, but I think that I know that this podcast isn't about how to write. This podcast is more about the philosophy of writing, but I think that this gives a picture. It opens a window into what writing is. I've done a lot of I always say I do a lot of thinking about writing, but I've done a lot of thinking about writing, and I actually want to make a YouTube series, because you have the capability of making stuff like that. I want to go get to the root of what writing is, and I want to essentially make it like a lesson plan or classes that go through the core of writing, that kernel of writing that starts writing. What started writing? Why do people write? What allows someone to write? I guess start at that middle point, the real root of writing, and then build off of that into what it is, and then how to do it, or what we're trying to do with it. And so I do a lot of thinking about this, and I've actually started researching linguistics, because I think that you have to do a lot of research into that. So hopefully, my plan is that maybe in a year, maybe in 2, I'll have it fleshed out for what I want to do for that. But but I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I've tried to apply what I've been thinking about and what I've been learning to my own writing. So this is how I write. All right, so I don't know if every author writes like this. FYI, I'm not certain. I don't talk to a lot of people who've written books. I think that maybe they don't. I think that if you write philosophy, you probably do more so. But I think if you write something that's fiction, I'm not sure. And I really wonder. I think this is a type of writing that is very valuable. But even though maybe not all authors write like this, I believe it's the best way to improve your writing. So this isn't a podcast about how to write really well. But if you apply this, like I've said before, we've got principles behind things. Okay, we've got ideas behind what we do, and if we can learn what those things are, we can be better at what we do. So the analogy that I would draw in a couple ways is in mathematics. There's a few different principles in mathematics, right? And we can learn those principles and we can apply them to tons and tons of different situations. I would say the same thing about an engine, right? If you know specific things about an engine, like how it works, the basic functions of an engine and the basic way it works, you can apply that along a broad set of things. If you know the basics of thermodynamics, you're going to be able to apply those to whatever field you're in, if you are building engines, I guess. So when I write, I have an idea, and when I was talking in the last podcast, so the first part of this podcast, I guess, I was talking about Octaviarium, these ideas that I'm going off of now really spring from that. And Octaviarium, if you can't remember, they took the idea of the octave, which I think is really cool, and they built a whole album around the octave. All right, and they had this whole idea of cyclicality and circling around things, and that's the same with a lot of artists with artistic motifs. They have the specific ideas, and they're circling around those specific ideas. And with my writing, I've got a specific idea. I've got a picture in my head. Maybe it's an emotion, a plot line, or a concept that I need to convey in some way. Or it might be even a character. All right, that would make sense as well. And the reader needs to, I need to connect this to the reader. The reader needs to connect to these different things, right? And when I say the reader needs to connect, the reader needs to understand what I'm saying. The reader needs to, as best as I'm able to, experience what I'm trying to write as closely as I experience that, right? Or maybe even experience it more than I can experience it, possibly, if that's even possible. So I've got this idea, this emotion, a plot line, and a concept, a character, and when I have that, I spend a lot of time fleshing out these ideas. For my writing process, most people don't know this, but I have the book that I'm finishing right now. Did I mention that right now? I can't even remember. I have a book that I'm finishing right now, and before I write anything, I map out the whole entire thing. I have an entire outline, like a actual outline of everything that happens in the book. Now, does what I have translate exactly to what happens in the book from the outline? No. But I have everything mapped out beforehand. But my outline is even pretty complex. I want to get another one. I'm working with one of these. So what I do with the outline nowadays, and I guess I did this before, and I didn't even realize I did this before. What I did, and I've got this really old outline, and I've got to quick grab it. All right. Okay, I'm back. So so I've grabbed my outline, and what I do when I make the story outline, because I'm really trying to get the plot points down. At first, when I first started doing this, I was like, well, people take a lot of time with the craft of writing, right? But it often seems like writers will just write a book without taking any thought to putting any thought to what the story is. So that they take tons and tons of time refining what is said and how to express what they're trying to say, but they don't take time refining what the ideas are behind what they're saying. So when I create an outline, and I'm still having trouble. When I create an outline, I start with really, really basic ideas. The book I'm writing now, what I started with is when I wrote down the outline, I started with stuff like, what do I want in this book? What ideas do I want to be conveyed in this book? What are some concepts? I really didn't have the concept of motif in my vocabulary yet, but at the same time I was applying that concept, or I was applying that idea to what I was writing, even though I hadn't even learned what a motif was by that time, because I started doing this stuff in like high school, and I didn't care as much about art back then. So going through a few of those different aspects, I'm fleshing out each of those things. I'm fleshing out if I'm fleshing out the character, I actually create a character profile. I make quotes from the character because I need to figure out who they are. I make their likes, their dislikes, their habits, who they are as a person, and what the story needs from them, and different things like that with characters. And so I think because I have the opinion that characters are the central idea of a story. They're the most interesting part of a story. So I probably spend the most time on characters, and I think that's the most important, because I think that if you don't connect to the characters, the story falls flat. And that's one of my biggest fears, is that people will just read and they'll be like, these characters aren't interesting. And I want them to be interesting. So if I'm writing, like if I'm trying to convey an emotion, if I've experienced that emotion, I make sure that I've taken time to express it as closely to how I've experienced it, right? Because that makes sense. Because if you experience emotion, it makes sense to go off of your own experiences. Or if you write anything, it's generally best to go off your own experiences, because you're going to know those better, or you're going to at least know the essence of those experiences better. So maybe you don't get all the details right, but you get the core of that, you get the feeling of that out. If I haven't experienced it, I actually do a lot of research on those things. So I've never had someone close to me die before, but I have people around me who have. And there's other things, like I've never been in war, but I can read an account of people who've been in war. And I don't know if everybody's able to do this, but I have I've always been able to just picture myself in a situation really, really well. So I just I think that maybe it's a part of creativity, maybe it's just part of my personality, maybe it's part of me. I just learned to fall into escapism, so this is part of escapism. I've been able to do this. Maybe it's because I've never had maybe I've only had forms of escapism that require me to do a lot of imagining with them. So when I was a kid, we watched a lot less TV than other kids, in my opinion. I'm almost certain. We didn't have a TV for a while. We didn't have video games. We didn't have a computer probably until I was in high school or junior high. I think it was high school. And we had books. We read a lot of books. And because of that, you have to imagine what's happening in the book. And I think that I developed a really good ability to imagine what was happening in the books. I think to a certain degree, you probably have to have a certain level of intelligence to do that. I don't think it's a very high level of intelligence. I'm not saying I'm a super genius, but when I try to convey emotions, I try to do a lot of research and see how those people are reacting. And then I also try to put myself in that situation, because I don't want it to seem like I'm just making stuff up, like I'm just taking stuff from other people and putting it in there. I want to actually at least experience it to a certain degree. So I try to experience it the best as I'm able to myself, or see it from the eyes of the character. Going back to the characters, actually, one thing I do is I try to actually experience the events, because I think it's easier when you've gone through an event. It's easier to write about what's going on in the event. right, than if you haven't. So if I can experience those events, even in my imagination, I can write about them better. One other thing I do with emotion is I find the closest analog, the closest thing that I've experienced, and I use that as a jumping off point to try to understand those emotions, try to understand that situation. This is similar to what I talked about with logic. So this whole situation with getting to the heart of what's being written, or the idea of a motif, like I said, you're circling around something with the motif. With Octaviarium, you're circling around the idea of an octave. And this is, as soon as I learned about logic, and I learned about this music, and I learned more about art. I have a friend who just who taught me tons about art, and I just think that I wouldn't know as much, and I wouldn't appreciate art as much without that friend. I learned about logic and I learned about art at the same time, or roughly the same time. So the idea of art, the idea of having this central idea, is really similar to logic. If you think about it like that, because the first step of logic is you're defining what you're talking about. And this first step of what I'm doing with writing is I'm kind of figuring out what that thing is I'm talking about. Now, I can't set perfect limits on it, because there's an author that I've heard talk before, and he talks about this idea, how people ask him, oh, what is your book about? And he's like, well, if I could tell you what the book is about, I wouldn't have written the book. I could just tell you. And I think that's the same idea with things within the book. When you're trying to set these limits, you're trying to set a perimeter around a character. Who is this character? What do they do? What is their personality? You're trying to flesh that out as much as you can. You're trying to get as many details. You're trying to get as many details of the emotion. You're trying to get as many details of the plot. You just keep on building off of the center. Maybe, for example, and I'll explain what I mean by the center. So let's just say you're writing a genre book. Let's just say you're writing something that fits nicely in a genre. Let's just say you're writing romance. Well, that romance is going to have central plot elements. It's going to have that romance at the core, and there's going to be more you're going to have to build onto that romance. So you've got to figure out what's going on with that, right? And in the same way, what I was doing, I needed to figure out what I was doing with my book, and also I needed to figure out, would the characters respond in this way? How should the characters respond? But what's the best way to convey these characters? And so I define those limits before I even begin the writing process. Okay. And the same idea kind of applies to writing as well. So now when I'm writing an essay, so this isn't fiction. When I'm writing an essay, I'm going to be laying something out in a very orderly and logical way. So when I write an essay, I have, it's a research paper. You have a thesis statement, and then you have your ideas and the research you have in connection to those ideas. It's a very logical paper you're putting together, and then you have your conclusions at the end, right? So that's nonfiction, but fiction benefits from the same very orderly and logical rule. I have an idea. I express that idea in some way. You don't necessarily, with fiction, you can express ideas in really creative ways. So, for instance, I could have a statement. I could have a very blatant statement. So with the book I have right now, I have a statement at the very beginning of the book. And it's the first impression you get. It's also called the hook, right? It's the first impression you get of the book. But I start talking about that statement, and I try to bring it, man, I can't talk. I start to talk about that statement, so I bring different details about that statement, and I eventually try to bring it back to that statement. I remind the reader, this is what we're talking about, right? Which is similar if you think about an essay, right? I have an idea, and then I'm talking about this idea, I'm fleshing it out, and I'm bringing it back to that idea, which is connected to my conclusion. It's a research paper. Come on. So, You can do this in creative ways, like a statement. You could have a person talking. You could have a single word. That's your idea. And when you're writing, you don't even have, it's not even that you're doing this. You're not even necessarily doing this the first part of the book. You can do this the first part of the chapter. I think of the start of every single chapter as a hook. A hook, if you don't know what that is, in writing, it's something that grabs the reader's attention, that makes them want to read more. I think of every beginning of the chapter as a hook. I want the reader to read that and be like, I really want to read this chapter to see what happens, and I want to finish it. And I even think throughout the chapter, I'm like, okay, I'm done with one idea. Let's move on to the next idea and maybe have another miniature hook that connects these two ideas together in some way. So like what I was saying, you could have a statement, you could have somebody talking, you could have a single word, you could have a sound effect, you could have a paragraph description that is your idea, like it's describing something that's happening, and that's the idea you're expounding on, maybe in that chapter, maybe in the whole entire book, whatever you're going to do. So just to lay it out for you in a more logical way, you can go about this creatively. You can fill in this structure in a lot of different ways. That's what's really cool, because we have this logical structure of thought, but we have a lot of ways of expressing this logical structure of thought. And I do think that creativity is a way of expressing this logical structure of thought that maybe goes beyond logic. I don't think it's better than logic, but maybe it gets to the limits of it in some way. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does something else with it that nothing else does. I'm not sure. So you have an idea, you express that idea, and then you explain that idea in some way, and then you justify that idea being part of the text. Okay, and that last part is probably the most difficult, because if I have an idea and express an idea in some way, if I have a description of an event happening really quickly or something like that, and then justifying that idea connects back to the central idea of your story, right? It connects back to that main theme. I guess we'd call it a theme in most stories. That main motif is what I prefer to call it. So when I'm writing in this way, rather than writing a clearly laid out essay or expose, I'm circling the topic. I'm circling the topic. Typically when I write an essay, I'm not circling the topic. I'm just going from point to point. It's very linear. But when you're writing something fiction, you're starting with that idea and you're kind of making circles around it, and you're talking about something that's related to it. Then you get farther away, and you bring it back to it, and then you talk about something that's farther away, and you bring it back to it. I wonder if this makes sense to anyone. This idea of doing this makes tons of sense to me. So when you go in that circle, I'm touching on ideas and things related to the topic, and this can be by explaining the action going on. So, I mean, events happen in a story. If you have an idea that someone says something or an event starts, your idea in that part is the actual event taking place, all right? And then you can go around that idea with dialogue. You can go around that idea with more things taking place, the story moving along with the event. You can go around that idea with other ideas. You can even use words that sound similar to that main idea or word, if it makes sense. I like the idea of going around the idea with other ideas, because what you can do is you can do this thing where you start an idea and you go around it a couple times. So you're kind of talking about it a bit. It's kind of circular in a bit. And then you jump to another one, and then you jump to another one, and you're piggybacking off the last idea to make your story flow better. So as an example, I think an example would do people well, just understanding how this works, is I've got a character who is proud, and I want this character to gain some humility. First, I paint a picture of the pride of that character, how that character is proud in the situation, and then I paint a picture of his pride in the situation where he'll gain the humility. So the author should already know about him, because I've already helped the audience. The audience should already know about him, because I've already painted a picture of him being proud. But I need a nice subtle reminder in that situation that the character is proud, so that when it gets to the end of that part, they understand what's going on. And then I need to make that character react pridefully in that situation, right? And this is the most important thing going on for that character. Maybe there's something else more important, but if I want to emphasize the character being proud, that's going to be the best part. That's going to be the most important part for that character. Now, unless I'm also trying to weave another narrative into this part, I want everything to feed into this character situation. I want everything to feed into this idea of him being proud in this situation. Where is he in space? All right. What does he say? What do others say? His thoughts, his reactions. What is he facing? It's all about him, and it doesn't explicitly talk about his pride. Maybe I don't explicitly talk about his pride in every single sentence. Maybe I don't mention his pride at all, but I have these hints because I painted a picture to the reader that the character is prideful in some way, and I'm making these little hints. This is a hint here, this is a hint there, that this character is prideful, what he's doing, how he's doing it. And so I'm setting this up for the audience, and then they think of his pride when they read. Even if I don't even necessarily say it, you kind of trick the audience. I think to a certain degree that writing a story is kind of like a magic trick. You're tricking the audience into thinking something, imagining something. You're bringing emotions out of the audience, even though they're not even experiencing something real. It's all made up. They're not they're experiencing something through little things on a page, right? So little letters on a page. The letters don't mean anything else unless they're read, unless they're understood. And the audience is like using their experience to create a scenario in their mind, and they're reacting to it emotionally. Maybe they're reacting to it physically. Maybe they're getting all caught up in it consciously. They're mentally getting caught up into it. And then when this character's humbled, I want to show all the different angles as well. I don't want to just say, oh, he was humbled. This goes back to that idea that show, don't tell. This is a big thing if you work with kids and they're writing, that you want them to show what's happening in the story they're writing, not to tell what's happening. And that's if you want to sum up what I'm saying, it's essentially show, don't tell. When you think about the essence of the situation, the essence of him being prideful, and then maybe him being humbled in the situation, you want to when you try to find that essence, it's going to probably be the hardest thing. And I think that when you look for it, if you can find it, if you can understand it, if you can express it, I think really that's part of what makes writing really, really good. If you can actually understand that essence of what that thing is, the core of what that thing is. Again, it goes back to that idea that author said, if I knew what the book was about, if I could tell you what the book is about in a sentence, I wouldn't write the book. And I kind of think about that, about stuff I write, because people are like, oh, what is the book about? And I give them a synopsis, but I don't think that's what the book is about, like by itself. Like the synopsis isn't what the book is about. Because when I write, I'm usually trying to convey something really big. And the odd thing about it goes back to that idea that simplicity, that motif, right? Before I talked about this idea that you start with one single idea and you build off of that idea, and it gets super complex, right? Seriously, if you want complexity, listen to Dream Theater's Octaviarium. It's an extremely complex album. You probably won't like it because most people, I don't think, do. You probably won't like it. It's a very, very complex album. Musically, it's in progressive rock. They're typically more complex. It's conceptually complex, but it starts off with this idea of the octave or going in circles, and that's it. And it builds off of that. And it's a kind of a paradox where you start off with one single thing. I think I've said this before, but when I started to write what I'm writing now, I used to think that being really complex was really good, like having all this complexity and convolution in the story was a good thing because you went from one thing to another and it was really weird and it was kind of fun. But then I realized Shakespeare doesn't do that, and I never was a big fan of Shakespeare, but I always liked his stories, like the basic structure of his stories and what he did with them. I always liked that, even if I didn't necessarily like hearing them. I never really liked listening to them, but the stories themselves, they're really simple, but they're really memorable, and part of me thinks the dude was able to figure out what that core was of that story, what he was trying to tell, and then he just circled around that idea. He just told the story in relation to that idea. He didn't branch off into some other area. He just kept it really simple, and he just kept on building the idea, which makes a lot of sense to me. It's kind of like the proverbial elephant with the blind man. So most people, when they write a book, or maybe not most people, I shouldn't say most people, but some people, let's just say, when they write a book, they come in contact with an idea, and they don't fully explore that idea. So with that proverb of the blind man with the elephant, is one grabs the tail, he's like, oh, it's like this, the elephant is like a rope, and another one grabs the trunk, and he's like, oh, it's like a tree branch. I don't know, a trunk isn't like it's as big around as a tree limb. And then another one runs into the side. It's like, oh, it's like a wall, but none of them actually understand what that thing is. Now, some authors that I've read, I think, haven't fully explored the ideas they want in their stories. Maybe they want too many ideas in their stories. I think you can make a good story if you focus on one idea and you just do a lot of research on that idea. You do a lot of deep thinking about that idea. You try to understand that idea, I can't say that word right now, as best as you're able to. And you're going to be able to write about that idea better than if you try to have all these different ideas in the book, right? Okay. So it's a paradox because you're simplifying things, but you're also becoming, it's not a mile wide and an inch deep. It's about 3 inches wide, but you can get lost in it. It's McGulligat's Pool. It's Dr. Seuss there. Whew. So when you read, if you ever read what I write, I think you may notice that. This, now you know how I write. You'll notice that things come up multiple times. You'll notice that I circle around things over and over again. And even when I don't mention that thing, what I write is related to that thing. Okay? So I hang my hat on this idea of motifs. I really think it's important. I really think as a writer, the idea of motifs is important. And if, again, to remind you, a motif is just a single idea that just keeps on coming up. And I think that even if you can't be subtle about it, it's still good practice to have that in there, to bring that back, because it connects everything back together, right? All right, so we're out of time for that. I hope this was useful. I mean, this is a 2-parter. I talked about obsession with the 3-parter, but this is a 2-parter, so hopefully you like it. I mean, if you like 2 parts rather than one, just because it's more content, more ideas on the same thing, tell me. I think that's really helpful. If you don't mind either way, whatever, it doesn't matter. So, our logical fallacy of the week, because it's important. It's important to know what logical fallacies are. It's important to know the specifics of logical fallacies. It's also important to be able to say specific. I have a hard time with that word. So, there's the fallacy of the fallacy of composition. All right. So the fallacy of composition is assuming that something true of part of a whole must also be true of the whole. So the best way I can describe what this one is, or the best example I can give, is if you're part of a group. And let's just say you're back in high school, and I didn't have this experience in high school, but I think people can understand. You have your cliques in high school, right? And you think, oh, this clique is like this clique is like this clique is like this. We don't like them because they're not part of our clique, and they're dumb and they're stupid and they're mean to us. Well, the individual, it might be the case that you ran into some people who are preps. I don't even know if they exist anymore in high schools. You might have run into preps, and they're really rude to you. Some of these preps you've met are really, really rude. They're really annoying. They just are really condescending. So you assume that everyone else who's a prep is mean and condescending. That is fallacy of composition, right? Just because you see part of it acting as part of a group acting one way, the whole is not the case. With other things, that's a little more difficult, right? It's a little more difficult to apply that. Give an example in other areas. So I'll keep my eye out, and I'll if I see another area that I can give an example with that's not with people, I'll bring that up in my next episode. So yeah, I hope that you, I hope that you have, if I don't die, I hope that you have a really good rest of your week. And my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.